You want to see a really big basket? Here you go. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca. In today's video, I have got a very long tutorial for you because this is a very big block and I want to walk you through how to put this together with all of the tips and tricks that I have to make sure that you're successful. If you don't know what this is block number 1 for the Sew Sampler Sew Along. I think it's called Pieceful Baskets. Every month starting in April 2024 and ending in March 2025, you're going to get a different block pattern in your Sew Sampler box. But don't worry, if this is a sew along that you want to do, but you're not interested in the other contents in the box, you can buy the patterns on Fat Quarter Shop's website, and I will link to that in the description box down below this video. So this video is long enough already. I'm just going to cut straight to the chase and let's get sewing. All my fabric is cut out according to the pattern instructions, and if you want to pick this block pattern up, there will be a link for it in the description box down below. So just start your fabric, cut it, and label it according to what the pattern says, and then we'll get sewing together. I do want to point out there are a couple of pieces of fabric that you're going to cut on the diagonal, and what that means is you're going to cut from one corner to the other corner of a square piece of fabric. And sometimes I feel like when I'm just trying to line my ruler up with the points on either end of that square, I can have a little discrepancy. And so one of the things that I've started doing that helped me get better results is to use the 45-degree line on my ruler to do the cutting and the measuring. And so what I'm going to do is find that 45-degree line, line it up with one of the raw edges of my piece of fabric, and then also at the same time, I'm going to line up the ruler so that it looks like it's going through both of those points on opposite end, and then I'll cut through that. If you want to make sure that you are absolutely on top of it, the other thing that you could do is just draw a diagonal on the wrong side of that fabric and make sure visually it looks like it's going right straight through, and then bring your ruler in and cut on that line that you just drew. I do want to point out that this block is going to be pretty big when it's put together. It's going to be unfinished at 17.5 by 17.5 inches. And this is a close-up look of this block. I'm really excited to put this together, but be careful because we're going to have some bias edges. So we're going to go nice and slow and take our time. So to get started, we're going to make 2 sets of half square triangle units. We're going to use an O and R fabric and an O and M fabric, and we're going to use the 2 at a time method. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through what this looks like step by step. But before we do, I want to point out that the pattern says we're always going to stitch with 1/4 inch. And we're always going to press our seams open unless the pattern indicates otherwise. So there are a couple areas in the pattern where arrows indicate a different pressing direction. You can follow those, or you can just press all of the seams open all of the time, whatever works for you. So to get started, I'm going to grab 2 of my squares. It really doesn't matter which ones I grab. And I'm going to draw on the back side of those fabrics a line going from one corner to the other. Now you can see I've already done that here. To do this, all I'm going to do is take a small ruler and put it in the point at one end and then the point at the opposite end and just draw a line. Now if you want to be a little extra and measure with that 45-degree line on your ruler to make sure that you are truly doing a 45-degree line from one corner to the other, that is perfectly fine. Once you have that drawn, you're going to match them up with its partner. So I have an O with an M and an O with an R, and we're going to take these to the sewing machine. And now I'm going to stitch with just less than 1/4 inch away from that purple line that I drew. The reason why I'm doing this with just a thread smaller than 1/4 inch is because it will allow me the opportunity to make sure that my half square triangle units are coming in where the pattern says they should. I usually find when I'm making half square triangle units, if I just allow for an extra thread or 2 extra in that seam allowance, then my units either come out exactly where they need to be, or if they're just a little bit too big, they're only off by a couple of threads, and I can always square those down. Now, I am sure somebody is going to ask about the marking tool that I use to draw the lines on the back sides of these fabrics. What I used is an air-soluble pen from Soline. I love these. They have two pens that I really like to use, and they both look and feel like a ballpoint pen. One is an air-soluble marker, and the other is a water-soluble marker. The difference is that this is a water erasing pen, this is an air erasing pen, and you can tell them visually because the air erasing is purple on the tips, whereas the water erasing is blue on the tips. The air erasing ink will go on the back side or right side of your fabric, and it'll stay there for a few hours or even up to a couple of days, and it's going to last even though you might be starching and pressing your fabric. So I really like these. The water soluble, those lines will go on blue, not purple, and they'll be removed once you starch or steam press your fabric. So once water hits it, they disappear. These are my go-to marking utensils. The only thing that I'll say about these is because they do show up as blue and purple, if I'm marking on dark fabric, sometimes I need to reach for something else. And in that case, my marking tool of choice is a white Choco pen. This just draws a fine line of chalk dust in a retractable blade. You can see it very faintly there that dusts off and doesn't leave any marking mistakes on my fabric. So between these three things, I don't need anything else. After I've sewn these together, I should have a line of stitching on either side of that line that I drew. I'm just going to bring a ruler, line it up right on top of that line, and I'm going to cut through it with my rotary cutter, and that's going to produce two triangle sets from each one of these squares. Now we're going to press it open. So what I do to press this is I set the seam with just a little bit of heat. All this is just touching the fabric with a hot, dry iron. It's helping the fibers in that thread that you added, as well as the fabric that you were working with, to relax just a little bit. And now I'm going to press the seam open. And so what I do is I open up the half square triangle unit and I lay it so that it's right side down. And I take my finger, open up the seam, and I just run my finger along, very gently, along that seam so that the fabrics are going underneath their coordinates. You can see that this tan type of fabric is under here and the green is under the green. We're going to do that for all four of these half square triangle units. I like to finger press them before I actually set them with heat. Can be a little finicky to get it started, but once you get it separated and opened up in one area, just run your finger pad along that seam. Don't apply too much pressure, and definitely don't stretch this because you don't want to make it wonky. Once I have all of them finger pressed, then I'll bring in a hot dry iron, and I'm just going to very gently kind of keep that seam open and then set the iron on top of it, letting it press that half square triangle unit. I don't want to do an ironing motion, but I will use the tip of my iron to kind of keep the seam laying flat open while I position the iron where it needs to go. If you've done this correctly, you should have a unit that looks something like this, where half of each side of that square is the fabric that you brought into the pair, and it is separated by a 45-degree line that starts and ends in the corners of the block. Now, one of the things that I love about fat quarter shop patterns is they give you plenty of room to square up. They assume that when you're going to make a half square triangle unit, you're going to piece them and then size down. So if you are a beginner and your 1/4 inch is not exactly where it needs to be, you're still going to be successful. I love that. Some patterns don't tell you that, which is why I showed you how I stitch my half square triangle units together by just cheating myself a thread or two. That's going to help make sure I get better results. But in the case of the fat quarter shot patterns, you're going to be set up for success if you just do what they tell you to do. This step, we're going to square up our half square triangle units to what the pattern tells us to do, and I want to show you how I do that. I like to get a cutting mat and a small ruler that has a 45-degree line on it. That 45-degree line I'm going to set right on top of the seam that goes between the two pieces of fabrics. And what's most important here are two things. The first one is that 45-degree line should be at each corner of the block. So if you were wonky anywhere on your seam, you might want it to be in the middle. It's more important that the points at either end match up with the corners of the block. The second thing is the size of the block. If you're going to size up to, let's say, 2.5 inches, we want to make sure that we can see that 2.5 inch mark on our ruler on top of the fabric, and we have some fabric maybe even extending off the sides of the ruler, so that we can be sure that we're going to be able to cut off all 4 sides of that block to get a nice tidy square. I'm going to size this up to what the pattern tells me to do, being very careful to measure twice and then cut once. Now I am using the Quilter's Select rulers for this. I absolutely love these rulers because they don't slip around like some of the other rulers do. I don't have very many of them. They are a little pricey. So I just make do with what I have. This is the only small Quilter's Select ruler that I have, but it gets the job done for just about everything. So there's one of my 4 half square triangle units, all nice and clean. You can see I no longer have the dog ears on it. And that 45-degree line is starting and ending exactly in the points of the square. That's what I want. We're going to need 2 of each of these for a total of 4. When we cut our fabric M, we left one of the pieces as a square, which we used to make these 2 half square triangle units. And then the other square, we cut on the diagonal once to produce 2 triangle units. We're going to need both of these for the next step. We're also going to need 2 of our fabric Q triangles and 2 of our fabric N triangles. Now, all of these triangles are going to have a bias edge, which means they're going to be stretchy, and it could be easy for you to distort that fabric. So just handle them very delicately. And if you starched before you cut your fabric, that's going to help a little bit more here. We're going to want to make sure that we're placing our fabric in the right orientation. So let me show you what we're going to do. To start, we're going to grab 1 Q and 1 N for each pile. And we're going to need to make sure we understand what we're looking at here. We're going to build out a half hourglass unit, which means that we're going to build out a unit that looks like this triangle from these 2 triangles. And the direction of the fabric is what's going to get you there. This took me a long time to understand. When you're looking at a triangle unit, you have 2 short sides and 1 long side. When you're building out these half hourglass units, you just want to make sure that that long edge is on the outside of your block, and that's going to give you your triangle shape. For one of the units, you need to have fabric Q in the top position and fabric N in the left position. And then, of course, your fabric N will come in here. And then for the other one, we're just going to flop those 2 pieces. So the straight long edge for fabric Q is going to be in the left position. The straight long edge for fabric N will be in the top position. And then our fabric M, will go in the lower right-hand corner. So we should have 2 units that look like this. Now, when we sew these together, we want to take this seam first and press that open. That's going to produce a triangle unit that should be about the size of this one. So sew these, being very careful of any bias edges. And to do that, I'm going to place my fabrics right sides together and make sure that the short edges are nice and lined up. And I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from that raw edge, making sure to not pull or tug on the fabric as it's going through the bed of my machine. We'll do the second one. Going slow because I have bias edges and I don't want to mess it up. Now I'm going to finger press just like I did before to get that seam to cooperate with me. Open it up, put my finger in between the two pieces of fabric in the seam, and then just run it very gently along that seam. Once my iron is heated up, I'll use the tip of it to kind of get my iron into position and just let it sit right on top of that seam. Do the same thing on the other one. Now, my half square triangle units can be made. One part of the half square triangle unit has just a triangle, and then the other one has the half hourglass unit. To put these together, we're just going to line them up so that that long edge is matching each other. And for this one, we could find the center of this triangle and line it up with this seam, but I know Fat Quarter Shop is going to have us square this down, so I have some room for error. But let me show you a trick that I've learned. To find center, one of the things that you could do is fold this in half along that long edge and then put that crease right on top of the seam. But the other thing that you can also do to help you with that is find the point right here of your triangle and lay it right on top of that seam. So you can check it from there and you can check it from here. The reason why I wanted to point that out is because I remember from geometry class in high school, my math teacher used to always tell us that the best way to make sure that you have a perfectly straight line is to have at least 2, preferably 3 reference points. The more reference points you had when attempting to draw a line, the better results you were going to get if you're trying to keep that nice and straight. So just a little tip that you can use if you can see that fabric poking out. I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 of an inch, and I'm being very careful here because I don't want to mess with any bias. Going nice and slow. And then we're going to press this seam open too, just like we did before. Start opening that seam. Run my finger along the entire thing to get it to lay open, and then use some heat. And if you wanted to be extra, you could get a clapper to put on top of that. All the clapper is going to do is absorb the heat from the fabric and allow it to cool in a pressurized, super flat position. Once these are cooled off, easy to touch, we're going to square them up. And they're going to be the same size as the half square triangle units that we made before. But it's not going to be as cut and dry as what we did previously. Yes, we want to pay attention to this 45-degree line, and yes, we want to make sure that it can be sized down to where it needs to go. But this spot right here where our fabric Q and our fabric N come to a point in the middle, this needs to be the dead center of the block. So whatever size we're squaring up to, we need to make sure that this measures half of that. So if we were to be squaring this to 2 inches, this point right here should be 1 inch up from the bottom, 1 inch down from the top, 1 inch from the left, 1 inch from the right. Does that make sense? So you might have to do just a little bit of math here. So what I'm doing is finding that halfway point, that halfway math number for me. Your calculator can help you with this. I'm also finding the 45-degree line. That 45-degree line on my ruler is going right on top of the seam, separating fabric M from my half hourglass block. And then the crosshairs for the halfway point that I calculated are going to go right on that point right there. And then as long as those 2 reference points match up and I've got fabric to trim off, I'm going to come in with my rotary cutter, sail through all of that, turn this around, and do the same thing. Now, when I flip it around, what I should actually see is that what I'm squaring to should be able to line up with those clean edges. So if I'm squaring this to 2 inches, I should be able to put the clean edges on the 2-inch mark on the left and the bottom of my ruler. And when I do that, everything else should settle into place, that center point as well as the 45-degree line. If everything looks good from those 3 reference points, then we're going to clean up our block. And then we should have a unit that looks exactly like this. And so what you're looking for here is that this 45-degree line starts and ends in opposite corners, just like we saw before, but also this 45-degree line starts and ends in this corner, and it comes to the dead center of the block. The next step's going to be really easy because we're just going to grab 2 of our P and 2 of our S fabrics, and we're going to sew them together along that long edge and press our seam open. So this one's not as finicky as the previous steps. Again, you're stitching with 1/4 inch right along the raw edge of that fabric. Then I'm going to come in and finger press that open. So far, this is what we've built out, and we're going to use some of these plus a fabric H and a fabric G to build out the center of our block. And it's going to kind of look a little bit like a churn dash crossed with a log cabin, kind of. It's really neat. First thing we're going to do is take these PS units and lay them out so that they're in the first and second row with fabric P on the outside of the block. And then I'm going to take a half square triangle unit here. We're always going to make sure that the blue is touching. This one we're not going to use yet, so I'm going to set it aside. We're going to use one of these. It's going to go in the center with the green pointing down and to the right. The other one we're not going to use yet, so I'll set that aside. I'm going to take my fabric H, put it here, and my fabric G, and put it below these 2. When I take this seam, these 2 pieces should end up being the size or the width of this piece. So that's why it looks a little off right now. And now for these 2 pieces, our half hourglass, half square triangle unit, say that 25 times fast, we're going to put them in these corners, but we need to make sure that we put the right one in the right place. The trick is that the fabric M should always be pointing down and to the right, and that blue should touch the blue before it. So I just happen to have that laid out the right way. If I would have changed them to get the blue to touch, the green would have been in the wrong places. This is not what we're looking for. And then if I would have had the green in the right place, then I wouldn't have had the hour or the churn dash look going. So what I'm looking for here is being able to have half of a churn dash on a half of a half square triangle unit. I need this 45-degree line, and all of this up here should look like a churn dash. So the way I'm going to sew this together is basically just like I would a 9 patch. I'm going to sew row 1, row 2, row 3, and put all of those together, making sure to press all the seams open. Once our rows are sewn together, we need to put the block together, but we want to make sure that we're not losing our points. And so for that, you're going to want some pins. What I'm going to do is line my rows up, and on the back side of this fabric, I can actually see the point because the seam is pressed open that I want to preserve. I'm going to put a pin right at the very top of that point, and then when I look on the other side, it should correspond with that. And then I'm going to stab this pin through the point that I want it to line up with on the other part of that seam. And then I'm just going to kind of shake this together so that the pin is straight up and down. I'm going to line up the raw edges of those 2 rows. And if there's another point that I need to preserve down here, I'm going to do the same thing. Otherwise, I'm just going to grab some clips, and I'm going to put them on either side of this pin to hold that seam where I need it to be. I'm going to make sure that my raw edges are lined up. Once I have the clips in, I can take that pin out, and I can finish clipping this entire seam in place. I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and sew along here with 1/4 inch, and then we'll press that open. Now, if you are nervous about this piece and you want to make sure you are not losing your points, One of the things that you can do is just keep an eye on that point intersection and make sure that your needle stays to the right of it as you're sewing. But the other thing that you could do is test your stitching. You can turn your stitch length up to a 5 or a 6 or some large number and take this seam and then take it back over to your mat, open it up, and if it lands exactly where you want it to, you can take it back over to your sewing machine and then stitch right on top of that basting line that you took before, just to lock everything in place with a normal stitch length of like a 2 or a 2.5. Mine looks pretty good, so we're going to keep that. As we're starting to sew these together, we are getting just a little bit of bulk, kind of where all these half square triangle units are coming in together. It's nothing that I'm too worried about, but if you are, there's a couple of tips that you can use to get this really super flat. The first one is, of course, press open, and then once you've pressed it from the back, press it from the top as well. The second tip that you can use is this handy dandy notion. This is called the Acorn Easy Press Pen. It is basically just a marker that holds starch inside of it, and you can draw that starch right on top of your seam. It doesn't take a whole lot, just a little bit. If you don't have one of these, you could also just mist it with some Best Press, just very lightly. And then you'll come in and hit that with a hot iron. Just let it press on top of your fabric. And then the final step that you can use to really get that super flat is a clapper. Set that on top of your hot seam that you've starched, you've pressed, and just let the seam cool and rest under the weight of the clapper. That wood is going to suck up the heat while also compressing down the seam, giving you a super flat block. Look at that, like a sheet of paper. Let's do this final seam. We'll pin it, stitch it, and press it. Spoiler alert, this is going to go on point in our final block so that it kind of looks a little bit like a basket this way, but we've got some more work to do before we're ready to turn it on its side. And the next step is going to be to put these fabrics on either side. We're first going to put our fabric K on the bottom and then a fabric J over on the right. Full disclosure, it's a couple days later. This block is so big that I literally had to take a break in the middle of it. But you already knew that because you have the pattern and you've seen the length of this video. So yeah, it is what it is. The good news is all of the complicated stuff that we're going to go over has already been done. I've showed you how to make half square triangle units. I've shown you how to keep your points, all that other stuff. And the rest of this is going to be pretty easy. So we're just going to build on those skills. The next step that we're going to do is take our fabric B and our fabric I, put those right sides together, draw a line, and make 2 half square triangle units out of these. Once these are pieced, we're going to build out our top border. So we're going to take that half square triangle unit and position it in the upper right corner so that the blue is pointing down into the left. Then we're going to take our fabric L and our fabric D and sew this together. Did I say down into the left earlier? I meant down into the right. I'm so sorry. It's still early. I need coffee. This is what your top row should look like. Now let's build out the side row. You're going to take the other half square triangle unit, it should be oriented the same way, another fabric L and your fabric C, and sew these together. Now we're going to attach those to our center block. Make sure that those 2 blue pieces that we added are down to the right and your churn dash is up to the left. You're going to put the top piece on first and then the side piece. I don't know what went wrong here, but something did because this is not as wide as the block is, and it should be. I know that my 1/4 inch when I sewed those together is perfect. I know that my points are matching up, so over here I'm good. There's just something going on over here. And I know the rest of the block is what it should have squared up to and everything else is fit. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to recover from this. I'm going to grab my seam ripper and I'm going to come in and just rip out the last couple of inches. And then I'm going to cut off just a little bit of this. I'm going to fold the block back. Use a ruler to make sure I get a nice straight edge. And I'm just going to cut that off. And now from a piece of scrap fabric, I'm going to cut off a replacement piece. I don't know how much I need, so I'm just going to cut a big chunk. I know what size this is, so I can make that part the right size, but I don't know how long I'm going to need. Now I'm going to come in and I'm going to stitch this new replacement piece to that prior piece. And I just want to make sure that where I'm going to sew through the short edge, it's not attached to the block. If I've got to rip out a few more stitches to do that, that's totally fine. When I take it to the sewing machine, I want to make sure the block is folded out of the way. And then when I come back over here, I'm going to press this open to get that really nice and flat, and then line it back up with that part of the block. Take it to the machine and start stitching on top of the previous line of stitching and just go all the way down with your 1/4 of an inch. And now I can press this open all the way along, but before I do, I just want to make sure that this now is longer than what we have over here. I'm just going to press it up and out of the way for right now. If it is, then I'm going to take my ruler and rotary cutter over here. I'm going to make sure that my ruler is nice and straight. Cut that off. And now that looks a lot better, and nobody's going to notice this once the whole quilt is quilted and done. You'll notice it right now because all you're seeing is this part of the quilt, but that's going to blend in. Nobody's going to even see it. We're going to continue to build out our borders. The first one is going to be fabric K and E on the left, and then fabric J and E on the top. Okay, let's talk about these points. They're not perfect. This one I would keep because it's just off a hair or so, but this one's off by like 1/8 of an inch. And while I probably won't see it in the entire finished quilt top, it is kind of irking me because I have taken a lot of care to not lose my points in other areas of the block. So I think I want to fix this. And as I was thinking about how I could fix it, it occurred to me that you could prevent this entirely. The pattern has you pressing these seams open, and I don't think that's necessary. I think when you're attaching the white fabric to the blue in both of your borders, both for the top and the side, if you just press that seam underneath the blue fabric, then your seams are going to go in opposite directions when you add your additional borders on, and it's going to make it a whole lot easier to nest your seams and get that perfect point right here. So my seams are pressed open. I can leave this if I wanted to because truthfully, once this is quilted and all done and shrinkled up, nobody's really going to notice this one point. Or I could rip this out, change the direction of the pressing for these seams down here and put it back together. That amount of work is only going to take me probably about 10 or 15 minutes to do. And what I'm trying to evaluate is that 10 or 15 minutes right now worth it in the long run? Is this going to bother me in the finished quilt enough that I should just go ahead and fix it? This one wouldn't bother me very much, but this one might. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to change it. All right, I've ripped that seam and I've twisted the one on the row that's already attached so that all of the seam is going underneath the blue, but it's still kind of pressed open right here. I'm not worried about that. And the seam up here is going under the blue, and now I can butt those right up against each other. Make sure they stay there, put a clip in it, and try to sew this together and hope my point lines up a whole lot better this time. What you didn't see before I came up with that pro tip is that I ripped this seam out like 4 or 5 different times and kept trying to pin that point right in place, and I still was getting it all messed up. Okay, that is much better. I did leave this one because that was off just by a thread. This one is spot on. So that only took me about 5 minutes or so to rip this entire seam, change the direction of those two, and sew it back together. Totally happy I did it. I know it might not seem like it, but we are almost done. All we got to do is set our block on point. Yeah, it goes this way. We just got to set it on point, and so we need to put our setting triangles around all 4 sides. So let's start with the setting triangles that we're going to put at the bottom of the block. To do that, you need a fabric A square and a fabric F square. We're going to put those right sides together, and we're going to do a stitch and flip in the bottom right-hand corner. For a stitch and flip, I am drawing a line on the wrong side of my fabric F from one corner to another. Then I'm going to lay this right sides together on top of fabric A, and I'm going to stitch right on that drawn line. Usually when I'm doing a stitch and flip, I will actually stitch just a hair to the right, like one thread to the right of that drawn line. That gives me a little bit of extra size or fabric or whatever in the seam allowance to make up for the thread that I'm adding in by doing my stitching. After we've done our stitching, we can test to make sure that this is accurate. So what I like to do is flip this over and give it a finger press, and I'm going to look at this corner. I should see that the flipped over piece of fabric completely finishes the square. It should not be too short, and it should not be too big. If it is too short, then you sewed too far to the left of the line. If it is too big, you sewed too far to the right of the line. So just kind of understand that when you go. And then also, this is a pretty big chunk. Look at that. If I open that up, look at that size. That's a pretty good size half square triangle unit. So if you want to save this for a future project, you can take a second seam about a 1/2 inch or so away from where we just sewed. That way, when we cut this off, you'll have a pre-sewn half square triangle unit for another project. This does not give us an arrow telling us that we should press to a certain side, so we'll continue to follow the instructions to press seams open unless otherwise indicated. Our next step is going to be to cut this on the diagonal, making sure that we're separating this in half. We should be going through the white and the blue, not just the white. We're also going to need to cut our other fabric A right on the diagonal too, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that while I'm here. And now we're just going to put these setting triangles around our block. So we're going to lay our block out on point. I'm going to make sure to put it the right way. We're going to sew the long edge of our triangles along the corners or the sides of the block to square it off like this. Now we're going to want to be really careful because this long edge of each of these setting triangles is bias and there's going to be some wonkiness here. So just be super careful when you're sewing this together. Also, we're going to want to find center. So let me show you how we do that. I'm only going to show you with one of these, and then I'm just going to go sew all 4 of them. First thing I'm going to do is pick up my setting triangle, and I'm going to fold it in half so that those points meet, and I'm going to find that center mark. I'm just going to finger crease it. Can't talk. So now I can see it, and I'm going to do the same thing with kind of remember where this one's going to go. With the side that I'm going to attach that to, I'm going to fold the block in half, finger press, finger crease that, and now I'm going to line up those 2 creased spots line up the raw edge of that fabric. I'm going to pin in the center to hold that right there. And then I'm going to pin on the left side, keeping the raw edges lined up, and pin on the other side. I think I said left side. I meant to say right side, but you get what I'm doing. I'm pinning on either side and in the center. I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew all the way down here with 1/4 inch. And then we'll press that actually underneath the setting triangle. So this final round, we're not going to press open. We're going to press towards the setting triangles. There it is, our first basket block. So excited to be doing this. I am quite pleased with how this has turned out, and I'm really excited to be putting together a basket quilt. This has been on my bucket list for a while, and what better way to do it than to tackle a block of the month sew along with Fat Quarter Shop. I'm so happy to be doing these tutorial videos, but I only want to make content that you want to watch. So if this is the type of thing that you would like to see me do more of when I get my subsequent patterns for future months, let me know in the comments down below. The best way you can encourage me to keep doing what I'm doing here is to subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, and leave me some love in the comments down below. I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!